Summer come in and had a piece of peppermint, which is her favorite, and then she went in. She said, "Mama, I want to go play with the boys." Candy walked her back to the house, and she asked the boys to keep an eye on her, and that's the last time I seen her, and was praying to God every minute that nobody would take them.
On June 15, 2021, little Summer Wells vanished from her home in Hawkins County, Tennessee. After more than a year of silence, her grandmother, Candus Harer, a key witness and the common link in two mysterious disappearances within the same family, finally spoke out. But instead of providing clarity, the interview raised even more questions, from her cold, detached tone to a perfectly polished account of that day, to contradictions with the sheriff's statements. This is the journey of dissecting her words to see what might truly be hidden. On the day Summer Wells vanished, Candus Harer offered a timeline that, on the surface, seemed straightforward, but quickly became a point of intense scrutiny. In her account, she said that her daughter, Candace Bly, had taken her to the emergency room because she was worried there might be a problem with Harer's replaced knee. At the ER, Harer claimed she received an injection to ease the pain and was prescribed medication to reduce swelling around the joint. She explained that they waited for the prescription to be filled before heading back. This sequence of events served as the opening frame of her narrative, establishing a medical errand as the reason for their outing that day. After leaving the hospital, Harer said they returned home. She mentioned going into her camper to rest, and in passing, referred to a brief stop at the horse stables earlier in the day. She described how groceries were brought into the house before she laid down for a short time. When she got back up, she recalled sitting in the doorway and suggesting that they transplant some small cactus plants into larger pots. According to her, they went ahead with this activity. It was during this moment, she said, that Summer came inside, holding a piece of peppermint candy, her favorite. Summer reportedly told her mother she wanted to go play with her brothers. Harer stated that Candace Bly walked Summer back to the house and told the boys to keep an eye on her. Harer emphasized that this was the last time she saw her granddaughter. What struck many observers wasn't just the content of Harer's story, but how perfectly it matched Candace Bly's own account. Both women, months after the disappearance, recounted the same details in the same order: the ER visit, waiting for medication, the cactus transplant, the peppermint candy, and the boys being told to watch Summer. Even minor elements, like the mention of the cactus and the candy, aligned without variation. To some, this level of consistency suggested reliability. To others, it raised the specter of rehearsed testimony. Viewers and amateur sleuths began to note that Harer appeared to have learned the script, delivering it smoothly and without hesitation, as if it had been memorized over time. This perception was reinforced by the absence of any natural deviations or slips that often occur when recounting genuine memories months later. In real-life retellings, peripheral details tend to blur, and people often correct themselves or recall new snippets. Yet here, the story felt locked and unchanged since the earliest versions given by Bly. Critics argued that such rigidity can be a hallmark of a constructed narrative, one agreed upon in advance to avoid contradictions, especially if the individuals anticipate repeated questioning from both law enforcement and the public. Beyond the perceived rehearsed quality, skeptics also pointed to the gaps in the timeline. Key intervals lacked independent verification. There was no confirmed documentation of the ER visit being tied to that day, nor any public confirmation of the stop at the stables. The exact time they returned home, how long Harer rested in her camper, and what precisely occurred in the moments leading up to Summer's disappearance remain unverifiable from external sources. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether they have cross-checked these locations and times against witness statements, surveillance footage, or medical records. As a result, the narrative, while neat and linear, sits on a foundation that is not independently substantiated in the public record. These missing pieces have fueled speculation about what might have happened during those unverified periods. Some theorize that events not included in the timeline could be critical to understanding the disappearance, whether involving an accident, an encounter, or a decision to omit potentially incriminating details. In this context, the absence of certain information becomes as significant as the details that were included, suggesting either selective memory or deliberate exclusion, adding to the uneases Harer's demeanor throughout her retelling. Many described her as cold, detached, and lacking urgency, qualities that jar with the image of a grandmother recounting the last moments she saw her missing granddaughter. Perhaps more telling, she admitted she had not been in proactive contact with law enforcement since early in the case. Her explanation was that she was available to talk. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or the sheriff's office, wanted to reach out, but she had not taken the initiative to call for updates or to push for new lines of inquiry. Observers found this striking, especially when contrasted with her readiness to call authorities for other matters, such as when YouTubers came onto the property or during disputes with Don Wells. To critics, it suggested a selective engagement with law enforcement, prioritizing immediate personal concerns over ongoing participation in the search for Summer. When taken together, these elements, the tight, unchanging alignment between two witnesses' accounts, the perception of a memorized script, the unexplained gaps in the timeline, and a distant, reactive posture toward investigators, create a portrait that invites more questions than it answers. Was the consistency the product of careful truth-telling, or the result of deliberate synchronization? Were the gaps simply mundane periods that defy recollection, or were they moments that someone preferred to keep off the record? And perhaps most importantly, why does a key witness seem content to wait for law enforcement to call, rather than demanding answers herself? In a case defined by unanswered questions, the way this timeline is told and the way it is not told has become a focal point for public doubt and investigative scrutiny. One of the most discussed elements in the Summer Wells case is the way two central witnesses, her mother, Candace Bly, and her grandmother, Candus Harer, have told what appears to be the exact same story for months on end. This is not simply a matter of broad events lining up. Their accounts match in minute detail: the sequence of stops on the day Summer vanished, the order in which each activity happened, the specific mention of transplanting cactus plants, the description of Summer eating a peppermint candy and declaring it her favorite, and the moment Bly says she walked Summer back to the house and told the boys to watch her. The match is so precise that it has become a focal point of public debate. In the eyes of some, it suggests two people telling the truth about a shared experience. In the eyes of others, it raises red flags about coordination and rehearsal. When two people witness or participate in the same events, it is natural for their recollections to overlap. But over time, especially across a span of many months, human memory tends to lose sharpness around the edges. Individuals recall the core facts but often differ in small ways, forgetting an exact time, swapping the order of minor details, or adding new elements as memories are triggered. In the case of Bly and Harer, the absence of these organic shifts has led some observers to suspect that what we are hearing is a unified story, one that has been deliberately constructed and maintained to ensure no contradictions emerge under questioning. The hallmarks of a unified story are easy to identify once you know what to look for. There is an almost scripted quality to the telling. The same phrases reappear, the same sensory details are emphasized, and the order of events never wavers. There is also a conspicuous lack of exploratory or uncertain language. No, I think it was around then, or I'm not sure if we did that before or after. Instead, the narrative flows smoothly, as though it has been practiced until it can be recited from memory. In a high-stakes case, this level of polish can be interpreted as a defensive measure, aimed at controlling the message and avoiding the kinds of inconsistencies that investigators might use to challenge credibility. It is not difficult to imagine why two closely linked family members might decide to lock in a single version of events. The potential benefits are obvious. By keeping every detail aligned, they minimize the risk that one will say something that the other contradicts. This, in turn, shields them from giving investigators grounds to suspect deception based solely on inconsistencies. In a situation where public suspicion is already high and where both women have faced scrutiny over their pasts, presenting a united front can feel like a survival strategy. Another potential motive for maintaining a perfectly matched story is the protection of the family's public image. The Wells family has been under a media microscope since the day Summer disappeared. Every interview, live stream, or recorded conversation is dissected online, often by people predisposed to doubt their innocence. In such an environment, a slip of the tongue or a poorly worded answer can be amplified into a damaging narrative. By sticking rigidly to a shared script, Bly and Harer may believe they are insulating themselves from the possibility of a stray comment becoming a viral talking point or a new line of suspicion. There is also the possibility that certain details have been deliberately omitted from the unified account because they could be perceived as unfavorable either by law enforcement or by the public. These might not be directly related to Summer's disappearance, but could involve personal choices, conflicts, or interactions that the women would rather keep private. By leaving them out of the official version and focusing only on an agreed-upon sequence of benign activities, they reduce the likelihood of having to explain or defend something that could be spun in a negative light. Yet, while a unified story can offer short-term protection, it carries long-term risks, especially when the audience includes trained investigators and experienced interviewers. Professionals in these roles are adept at detecting rehearsed narratives. They note when the same unusual detail is repeated verbatim by multiple witnesses, or when timelines are recalled with an unrealistic degree of precision long after the fact. They also understand that perfectly matching accounts are, ironically, less likely to occur naturally than slightly divergent ones. Minor differences are a normal feature of truthful recollection. They signal that each person is recalling the event independently, rather than reciting from a shared template. Linguistic analysis can reveal even more. Experts look at factors such as the rhythm of speech, the use of qualifiers, and the inclusion eps or absence of sensory impressions. When two people use identical phrasing to describe the same action, for example, both saying, "We transplanted the little cactuses into bigger pots," rather than expressing it in their own words, it can indicate that the line has been rehearsed. Likewise, if both accounts maintain exactly the same time structure, down to the sequencing of minor, non-essential activities, it suggests an effort to preserve that structure across retellings. Over time, this rigid alignment becomes more conspicuous, not less. There is also the danger that a unified script can be undermined by unplanned moments. In casual conversation or under stress, people sometimes revert to a more natural, unfiltered mode of speaking. If even one detail slips out that doesn't match the established story, it can call the entire narrative into question. Inconsistencies that appear after months of perfect alignment are particularly damaging because they raise the question of why the detail is changing now. Was it a genuine memory surfacing, or an accidental revelation of something that was previously hidden? From a psychological standpoint, maintaining a unified story requires sustained cognitive effort. It demands that each person continually monitor their own speech, recall the exact, approved, sequence, and remain alert for any cues that might prompt them to elaborate beyond the agreed boundaries. This mental load can increase over time, particularly as fatigue, stress, or unexpected questioning take their toll. The very discipline that keeps the story intact can, paradoxically, make it more fragile in the face of prolonged scrutiny. In the court of public opinion, the perception of a rehearsed story can be as damaging as proof of one. For many observers following the Summer Wells case, the near-perfect mirroring of Bly's and Harer's accounts has already eroded confidence in their openness. Whether or not the story is true, its delivery has become a point of skepticism. The more it is repeated without variation, the more it reinforces the belief that it is a crafted narrative, one designed less to illuminate what happened than to manage how the tellers are perceived. In sum, the precise, unwavering match between these two women's accounts months after the fact may be the product of truth told faithfully, or it may be the product of deliberate rehearsal. If it is the latter, the motives could range from self-protection to image management to the concealment of tangential but sensitive details. But whatever the intent, the risks are real. Experienced investigators and attentive audiences can detect the markers of a unified script, and once the suspicion of rehearsal takes root, it can be difficult to convince anyone that the story is not only consistent, but also complete and authentic. In examining the timeline given by Candus Harer on the day Summer Wells disappeared, one of the most striking elements is the presence of key intervals that have no independent witnesses or verifiable evidence to confirm them. While certain points such as a visit to the emergency room and a stop to pick up medication are described in detail, the public has not seen documentation, corroborating witnesses, or surveillance footage to substantiate those events as occurring exactly when and how Harer says they did. From the moment she left the ER to the time they were back at the property, there are significant stretches where no third party can confirm their whereabouts, actions, or even the precise timing of each step. This absence of independent verification becomes especially important when considering the nature of the medical treatment Harer claims she received that day. According to her account, she had been concerned about her knee, one that had previously undergone surgery, and went to the ER for evaluation. There, she said, she received an injection to ease the pain and reduce swelling, and was prescribed medication. For many, the idea of engaging in multiple errands or physical activity after such a procedure raises questions. An injection for joint pain can sometimes cause soreness or temporary weakness, and medical advice often includes resting the treated joint. Yet, Harer's timeline includes not only returning home, but also engaging in a minor gardening activity, transplanting cactus plants shortly afterward. While this is not impossible, the choice to engage in such activity so soon after a knee injection has prompted skepticism about whether the timeline is as straightforward as it is presented. It is within these unverified stretches of time that suspicion grows. The lack of confirmed witnesses or physical evidence creates space in which an unmentioned event could have taken place. This blind spot in the day's chronology is exactly the kind of gap that seasoned investigators pay close attention to. Whether it was an accident, an interaction with someone outside the family, or a moment that the speaker simply doesn't want scrutinized, the fact remains that the public record does not account for these minutes or hours with independent detail. In many missing persons cases, such unexplained windows often become the pivot points around which theories and investigative focus revolve. The reasons for omitting certain events or details from a public or even police-facing account can vary. In some cases, a person might fear that including a particular detail could draw suspicion toward themselves, even if the event in question was innocent. For example, encountering someone with a controversial history, or being in a location that is later connected to a criminal lead, can appear incriminating regardless of actual guilt. In other cases, the omitted detail might involve another individual whose privacy the speaker wishes to protect, perhaps someone with unrelated legal troubles, a strained relationship with the family, or a history that could draw unwelcome attention. There is also the possibility that a witness may genuinely see a portion of the day as irrelevant to the disappearance and choose not to include it, not realizing that investigators view such gaps as potentially significant. From a psychological perspective, there is a difference between inventing new details to cover a gap and simply omitting the gap altogether. Harer's approach appears to fall into the latter category. Her narrative does not attempt to fill every moment with an activity or explanation. Instead, she moves directly from one described event to another, without elaborating on the transition between them. This choice can be strategic. The more fabricated details a person offers, the more opportunities there are for those details to be disproven. By leaving a section of time unaddressed, a speaker avoids creating new points of vulnerability. However, this same strategy can also make the omission stand out. The absence of explanation draws attention precisely because the rest of the story is told in such clear, specific terms. Behavioral analysts often note that deliberate omissions are not always easy to spot in the moment. But when a story is retold multiple times, the pattern becomes clearer. If the same section of time is always skipped over without variation or added detail, it suggests that the omission is intentional rather than an oversight. In Harer's case, the ER visit, the stop for medication, and the cactus planting session are all firmly anchored in her narrative, but the spaces in between remain hazy. This is particularly notable given how well-rehearsed other parts of her account appear to be when compared with Candace Bly's identical retelling. In the context of the Summer Wells investigation, such gaps matter because they represent moments where something significant could have occurred without leaving a public trace. Even if the omitted events are entirely innocent, the lack of transparency can create an environment in which speculation thrives. Online commentators, amateur sleuths, and even experienced investigators may view these voids as opportunities for hidden actions, the movement of a vehicle, a conversation with a third party, or the decision to alter plans that could be relevant to what happened to Summer. The challenge for law enforcement is to determine whether these blank spaces in the timeline are simply unremarkable slices of an ordinary day, or whether they hold the key to understanding a crime. Ultimately, the combination of unverifiable segments, the questionable practicality of the activities following medical treatment, and the choice to omit rather than invent detail paints a complicated picture. It is a narrative that is both specific and vague, rehearsed yet incomplete. For the public and for investigators, the unanswered question is whether those gaps exist, because there is nothing to tell, or because telling the truth about them would change the story entirely. One of the more telling dynamics in the Summer Wells case involves the gap between public statements from Hawkins County Sheriff Ronnie Lawson and the responses from Candus Harer, Summer's grandmother. Sheriff Lawson has publicly indicated that the family hired an attorney and has not been cooperating with investigators to the degree the public might expect. In the language of law enforcement, not cooperating often means the individuals are no longer providing voluntary interviews, updates, or new information outside of formal legal channels. This, understandably, can be read by the public as a withdrawal from the active search for answers. Harer, however, has pushed back against this characterization. In her own interview, she denied that she has been uncooperative and claims she is willing to answer questions when contacted. To her, the issue is not resistance, but rather a matter of not being approached by authorities. She frames her position as one of availability rather than obstructionist stance that shifts the responsibility for contact and information gathering onto law enforcement rather than herself. The difference between being willing when asked and proactively providing information is more than a matter of semantics. In a high-profile missing child case, the public expectation, and indeed, the investigative ideal, is that anyone close to the situation would remain in frequent, voluntary contact with detectives. This proactive communication might include calling to share new recollections, clarifying past statements, or even just checking in to ask about investigative progress. In contrast, a reactive posture waiting for authorities to initiate contact can create the impression of detachment or passivity, even if the person feels they have nothing new to add. This distinction is magnified when we consider Harer's response to other situations. Notably, when YouTubers or self-styled investigators allegedly trespassed or intruded onto the property, Harer and others in the family were quick to call law enforcement to report the intrusion. That action shows a clear willingness to engage police when the matter directly affects them in the present moment. It raises the obvious question: why call the sheriff's office for property issues or personal boundaries, but not to inquire about developments in the search for Summer? From a public perception standpoint, this discrepancy can be damaging. It suggests a hierarchy of urgency in which personal comfort takes precedence over pressing for answers in a missing child case. It is worth noting that some people in similar situations genuinely believe that the best approach is to wait until investigators reach out. They may feel that law enforcement will call them if and when they are needed, and that anything they initiate themselves could be seen as interference or annoyance. Others may be wary of prolonged questioning or rehashing traumatic events, and thus subconsciously prefer a more reactive stance. However, when this approach is contrasted with the willingness to pick up the phone for unrelated disputes or property concerns, it can be interpreted rightly or wrongly as selective engagement. This selective engagement has a measurable impact on public trust. In missing persons cases, particularly those involving children, the narrative is shaped as much by perception as by fact. When a close family member appears proactive, emotional, and relentless in their pursuit of answers, the public tends to view them as more credible and invested. Conversely, when a family member appears guarded, minimal in their outreach, or responsive only on their own terms, suspicion can take root, even without direct evidence of wrongdoing. For Sheriff Lawson, his statements about the family's lack of cooperation serve a dual purpose. They inform the public about investigative challenges and potentially apply pressure on the family to re-engage. For Harer, her rebuttal is a way of defending her own credibility and pushing back against what she may see as a misrepresentation of her willingness to help. The problem is that both statements can be true from the speaker's perspective. Lawson may measure cooperation by ongoing, proactive involvement. Harer may measure it by a willingness to respond when contacted. The gap between these definitions is where public opinion is formed and where reputations can be lost or salvaged. The optics are not helped by the fact that the Wells case has been heavily covered, dissected, and speculated upon in online communities. Every statement, every choice, and every perceived inconsistency is cataloged and analyzed. In that environment, even small differences in behavior can be magnified into questions of character. Harer's apparent lack of initiative in contacting investigators could be viewed, by some, as emotional detachment, a sign of legal caution under an attorney's advice, or even an unwillingness to revisit certain aspects of the day Summer disappeared. Ultimately, the interplay between Lawson's public comments and Harer's self-defense underscores one of the central tensions in this case: the balance between protecting oneself and actively pursuing justice for a missing child. If Harer's goal is to maintain her credibility in the eyes of both law enforcement and the public, closing the gap between willing when asked and willing to step forward may be crucial. In a case where answers have been elusive for years, the willingness to engage, not only when pressed, but by one's own initiative, is often what separates those seen as passive witnesses from those seen as active advocates. And in the court of public opinion, that difference can matter almost as much as the truth itself. Public records and investigative commentary surrounding the Summer Wells case have pointed to a troubling history for Summer's grandmother, Candus Harer. Multiple sources have claimed that Harer has faced prior legal trouble, including allegations of child endangerment in both Georgia and Wisconsin, as well as a charge of domestic violence in Wisconsin. The domestic violence record is reportedly sealed, meaning the full details are not publicly accessible. Sealed records are not necessarily proof of guilt. They may be sealed for privacy, legal technicalities, or because the case was dismissed, but their existence can create an air of mystery and speculation, especially when connected to an ongoing, high-profile investigation involving a child. Alongside these allegations is another striking detail: Harer is said to have used multiple aliases over the years. These include variations of her name such as Candus Harer, Candace Bly, Candace Harper, Candace Harder, and a more unusual alias, Celeste Slobs. On paper, using different names is not inherently suspicious. People change their names for entirely legitimate reasons, including marriage, divorce, or even personal preference. However, when multiple legal names appear in official records, particularly alongside criminal charges or sealed cases, the practice can raise questions about intent. There are several possible explanations for these name changes. The most benign is marital status. A person who marries or divorces may adopt or discard a spouse's surname, leading to a trail of legitimate variations. Another possibility is the use of different names in different states due to relocation, employment, or family arrangements. However, in some cases, name changes can be strategic, a way to create distance from a prior legal history, avoid association with public records, or reset one's public identity in the aftermath of scandal or criminal charges. The fact that one of Harer's aliases, Celeste Slobs, deviates so sharply from her given name makes it harder to attribute solely to marital changes. Such an unusual alias could be a legal name change, a chosen pseudonym, or a name acquired through unconventional circumstances. From a legal standpoint, aliases complicate both background checks and active investigations. Law enforcement agencies conducting criminal history searches must account for all known variations of a person's name to ensure they capture every relevant record. If an alias is unknown to investigators, or is misspelled or incomplete in databases, critical records could be missed. This is why police often cross-reference date of birth, social security number, and known addresses when running background searches. In Harer's case, the presence of multiple aliases across different jurisdictions means investigators must cast a wide net to ensure nothing is overlooked. The allegations of child endangerment in both Georgia and Wisconsin are particularly relevant to the Summer Wells investigation. While the details of those cases are not fully public, the very nature of the charge suggests incidents involving a risk to a child's safety or welfare. Even if those cases did not result in convictions, they may inform investigators' assessments of Harer's history and potential patterns of behavior. The domestic violence charge in Wisconsin, especially with the records sealed, adds another layer of complexity. It is unclear whether that incident involved a family member, a partner, or another party, but domestic violence histories can influence how investigators view the interpersonal dynamics in a missing child case. In terms of the ongoing investigation into Summer's disappearance, these past allegations and the use of multiple aliases could have both practical and perceptual impacts. Practically, if law enforcement is already aware of this history, it could affect how they weigh Harer's statements, how they prioritize follow-up questions, and whether they consider her a potential source of relevant background information. It might also influence their interpretation of her behavior during and after the disappearance, for example, whether her manner of speaking, level of cooperation, or choice of details matches patterns they have seen in prior incidents. From a public perception standpoint, this information can be deeply damaging. In a high-profile case where the public often plays an active role in generating tips and leads, credibility is currency. A person with a documented or rumored history of child endangerment will naturally face more suspicion when a child in their care goes missing, even if the historical charges are unrelated or legally resolved. The presence of multiple aliases can feed into narratives of secrecy, avoidance, or manipulation, narratives that can gain traction quickly in the court of public opinion. At the same time, it's important to note that multiple aliases and past allegations do not automatically equate to guilt in the current case. Many people with complex legal or personal histories have no involvement in later incidents. However, in the charged environment of a missing child investigation, every piece of background information can take on amplified significance. Investigators will likely be asking themselves whether the past charges reflect isolated incidents or part of a broader behavioral pattern, and whether the name changes were simply the result of life's normal events or part of an intentional effort to obscure certain parts of a record. Ultimately, the combination of prior allegations in 2 states, a sealed domestic violence case, and the use of 5 distinct aliases creates a complicated portrait of Candus Harer. It is a portrait that investigators must parse with care, balancing the factual record against the need to avoid assumptions unsupported by evidence. For the public, these details, true or untrue, proven or unproven, contribute to the growing sense that many aspects of the Summer Wells case remain obscured. Whether these elements ultimately prove relevant to solving the disappearance, they underscore one truth that has defined this case from the start: very little is as simple as it first appears, and every name, date, and record must be examined with precision. Years before the disappearance of Summer Wells, another tragedy struck the same family: the unexplained vanishing of Rosemary Bly, Summer's aunt and the daughter of Candus Harer. Rosemary went missing in 2009 from St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. She was last seen driving away from her home, reportedly to visit a cousin in Cushing, a short distance away. Her car was later found in a parking lot near a local bar, but there were no signs of foul play, and no confirmed sightings have been reported since. Despite periodic reviews of the case and appeals for public assistance, Rosemary's fate remains a mystery, with no definitive leads emerging in over a decade. From a statistical standpoint, the presence of 2 separate, unsolved disappearances within the same immediate family is extraordinarily rare. While families can experience multiple tragedies, It is exceptionally uncommon for two close relatives to vanish without resolution in unrelated incidents. This rarity inevitably fuels public speculation. Some observers point to the sheer improbability and wonder whether there could be a shared factor, either environmental, situational, or relational, that connects the two cases. Even without concrete evidence of a link, the unusual coincidence has made the Wells family a focal point for deeper scrutiny. The environment in which these disappearances occurred has been a recurring point of public discussion. In Rosemary's case, the disappearance happened in rural Wisconsin. In Summer's case, it was rural Tennessee. In both instances, the remoteness of the area could have hampered immediate searches and reduced the likelihood of eyewitness accounts. However, critics argue that environmental challenges alone cannot fully explain two long-standing mysteries within the same family. This has led to theories, some speculative and some more grounded, suggesting that interpersonal factors, lifestyle patterns, or even undisclosed conflicts might have played a role in creating conditions where such tragedies could occur. The public perception of Candus Harer is inevitably shaped by this history. As the mother of a woman who has been missing for more than a decade and the grandmother of a missing child, Harer occupies an unusual position. She is simultaneously a recurring figure in two separate missing persons investigations. To some, this makes her a figure of deep sympathy, someone who has endured more loss and uncertainty than most could imagine. To others, the pattern invites skepticism, particularly when coupled with perceived inconsistencies or omissions in her statements about Summer's disappearance. The result is a complicated public image, one that blends pity with suspicion. One of the key impacts of this dual history is on the credibility of Harer's words in the present case. For members of the public, who are already inclined to distrust her, the existence of another unsolved disappearance in her immediate family reinforces doubts. They may interpret any vagueness, guardedness, or emotional detachment in her interviews as signs of withholding information, even if such behavior could equally be explained by trauma or personal coping mechanisms. For others, the connection between the two cases is simply too coincidental to dismiss outright, and so they view her current statements through the lens of unresolved questions from Rosemary's case. This historical context also influences how investigators and journalists approach Harer. While law enforcement has not publicly suggested a direct link between the two disappearances, they are likely aware of the potential for overlapping contacts, behavioral patterns, or other data points that could inform their understanding of the present case. Journalists and true crime commentators, meanwhile, have seized on the narrative value of the coincidence, often placing the two cases side by side in their coverage to highlight the rarity of such circumstances. It is important to note that statistical rarity does not imply causation. Two unrelated tragedies can, and do, occur within the same family purely by chance. Rural communities can be vulnerable to certain types of crime or accidents, and the lack of witnesses or physical evidence can prolong the mystery indefinitely. Still, in the arena of public opinion, especially in the age of online forums and social media, the existence of a prior, unresolved disappearance creates fertile ground for speculation, sometimes to the detriment of objective analysis. For Harer herself, this history is both a shield and a burden. On one hand, it allows her to position herself as someone who understands the agony of having a loved one vanish without a trace, which can lend emotional weight to her public pleas for information. On the other, it exposes her to a level of skepticism and rumor-mongering that few in similar situations have to endure. Each public statement she makes about Summer is inevitably filtered through the knowledge that this is not the first time she has been at the center of such a mystery. In the end, the disappearance of Rosemary Bly is an unresolved wound that shadows the search for Summer Wells. Whether the two cases are entirely unrelated or connected in some unseen way, the fact remains that they have altered the trajectory of how the public engages with Candus Harer's narrative. Sympathy, suspicion, and statistical improbability combine to create a uniquely charged atmosphere, one in which every word, every detail, and every omission is scrutinized not just in isolation, but in the context of a family history marked by loss without closure. In her public interview following the disappearance of Summer Wells. Candus Harer's tone of voice and body language stood out immediately to many observers. She spoke with a noticeable coolness, her delivery flat and largely devoid of visible emotion. There were no visible surges of grief, no voice breaks, and few, if any, facial expressions that suggested distress. For some, this could be explained by personality or emotional exhaustion. For others, it came across as a form of detachment that was difficult to reconcile with the gravity of a missing child case. The absence of expressive cues, the kind often expected in high-stress, emotional circumstances, became a focal point for criticism, fueling ongoing debate about her sincerity and state of mind. This impression was reinforced by her communication style, which largely adhered to a narrow, rehearsed timeline. Harer rarely ventured beyond the main sequence of events she had outlined: the trip to the ER, waiting for medication, returning home, planting cacti, Summer eating peppermint candy, and then going inside. When interviewers or conversational cues opened the door for elaboration, she tended to deflect or pivot back to the established chain of events. There was little exploration of context, feelings, or peripheral details, the kinds of additions that often arise naturally in spontaneous conversation. To some viewers, this was a sign of focus and discipline. To others, it suggested careful boundary setting, perhaps to avoid revealing inconsistencies. The timing of Harer's decision to appear publicly also drew attention. Her interview came after Don Wells, Summer's father, was incarcerated on unrelated charges. This shift in family circumstances may have influenced her willingness to speak. With Don absent, Harer could have felt a greater sense of responsibility to represent the family publicly, or she may have viewed the moment as an opportunity to shape the narrative in a way that would be harder to do if Don were present and speaking for himself. Alternatively, the timing might reflect a calculation that her words would be less likely to conflict with Don's, thereby reducing the risk of visible contradictions between family members. Another possible factor is the delicate balance between cooperation and self-protection. By granting an interview, Harer demonstrated a willingness to engage with the public and, indirectly, with the investigation. On the surface, this projects an image of cooperation. She is answering questions, putting her account on record, and ostensibly assisting in the effort to find Summer. Yet the restricted scope of her answers, the controlled tone, and the reluctance to deviate from the established timeline may signal an awareness of legal risk. In high-profile missing person cases, every public statement can be dissected by law enforcement, media, and online analysts. A single poorly chosen word or unguarded admission can be interpreted rightly or wrongly as incriminating or inconsistent. This creates a dual motive, appearing cooperative enough to avoid being labeled unhelpful, while keeping a protective buffer to avoid providing investigators with material that could be used against her or the family. Such a strategy, whether intentional or instinctive, often results in precisely the type of controlled, unemotional presentation Harer displayed. It minimizes exposure but can also erode public trust, especially in a case where emotions are expected to run high. Observers who specialize in behavioral analysis have noted that low emotional expression does not automatically indicate deceit. Trauma, shock, prolonged stress, and even cultural or personal norms can influence how a person reacts publicly. However, in the realm of public perception, particularly when a child's life may be at stake, these nuances are often overshadowed by immediate, emotional judgments. People expect to see certain behaviors from a grieving or desperate family member, and when those expectations are not met, suspicion can take root quickly. Ultimately, Harer's tone, body language, and interview style have become part of the broader narrative of the Summer Wells case. Whether they reflect a cautious legal strategy, a personal coping mechanism, or something else entirely, they have shaped how her statements are received and interpreted. Her appearance managed to accomplish two things. At once, it placed her in the public eye as a seemingly cooperative figure, while also maintaining a tight, almost impermeable boundary around the information she was willing to share. This balance may serve her in protecting herself, but it also ensures that the questions surrounding her and the disappearance of her granddaughter remain as persistent and unresolved as ever. The release of Candus Harer's interview quickly ignited strong reactions from YouTubers, online commentators, and followers of the Summer Wells case. True crime content creators dissected her words line by line, replaying clips to highlight tone, timing, and subtle shifts in expression. Some viewed her appearance as a long-awaited step toward transparency, praising her for finally speaking publicly after more than a year of silence. Others, however, saw it as a performance, a carefully controlled statement designed more to manage perception than to genuinely aid the investigation. In the fractured world of online discussion, these opposing interpretations fueled a surge of debate, often spilling into heated comment threads and live streams. A major point of contention was the reliability and completeness of Harer's account. Supporters argued that her straightforward delivery of events, the trip to the ER, waiting for medication, returning home, planting cacti, summer eating peppermint candy, and then going inside demonstrated clarity and consistency. They saw no obvious contradictions in her timeline, suggesting that her ability to recount it smoothly was a sign of truthfulness. Critics countered that such precision, especially when it perfectly matched her daughter Candus, Bly's earlier account, could be the result of rehearsed storytelling rather than spontaneous memory. The lack of added details or natural tangents struck them as suspicious, as did her refusal to elaborate beyond the narrow framework of the timeline. Within this context, some online voices raised an intriguing possibility that law enforcement may have encouraged or at least monitored this interview as a way to test Harer's reactions under public scrutiny. In high-profile investigations, it is not uncommon for authorities to study how individuals respond when their statements are placed under the microscope of media and public attention. A carefully crafted interview can act as a subtle pressure point, potentially revealing inconsistencies, changes in body language, or shifts in demeanor over time. If this was indeed a strategic move by investigators, it may have been intended less for public consumption and more as a diagnostic tool in the ongoing case. This theory gained traction in online forums, where followers noted that the interview offered few new facts, yet seemed to serve as a behavioral snapshot. Harer's composure, her unwillingness to deviate from the established story, and her avoidance of speculative or emotional language all stood out. For some, this was further evidence of a protective stance, one that shields her and the family from legal vulnerability, but also leaves the public hungry for answers. For others, it suggested a person simply trying to stay within her comfort zone, speaking only to what she knows and refusing to wander into conjecture. The YouTube true crime community played a significant role in amplifying these interpretations. Channels dedicated to the Wells case produced breakdowns, sometimes in multi-hour live streams, comparing Harer's statements to prior public remarks by other family members. Some creators employed behavioral analysis techniques, while others leaned more towards speculative storytelling, weaving her interview into broader theories about the case. This dynamic created a feedback loop. The more the interview was discussed, the more its perceived significance grew, regardless of whether it contained substantive new evidence. Public perception remains deeply divided. On one side, there is a belief that Harer's decision to speak, even if limited in scope, represents a step forward, offering investigators and the public a clearer sense of her perspective. On the other, there is the conviction that the interview added nothing of investigative value and may have been a calculated move to reinforce a narrative that has been in place since the earliest days of the case. In this view, her appearance may have solidified doubts rather than dispelled them, creating yet another layer of complexity in an already tangled story. The lingering question is whether this interview was a genuine breakthrough or merely another smokescreen. If it was a breakthrough, its value lies in the potential for subtle shifts in public and investigative momentum, perhaps nudging new witnesses to come forward or inspiring fresh lines of inquiry. If it was a smokescreen, it may have succeeded only in deepening the fog, providing just enough content to occupy attention without shedding real light on Summer Wells' fate. For now, the interview remains an ambiguous milestone in the timeline of the case. It is a piece of the puzzle, perhaps an important one, but not the final answer. Whether history will remember it as the moment the truth began to surface, or as a carefully staged act in a long-running drama depends on what comes next. Until then, it stands as both an object of intense public analysis and a reminder of how, in cases like these, every word and gesture can be as scrutinized as the physical evidence itself. In that sense, the interview may have been less about telling the story of that day and more about watching how the storyteller chose to tell it. In examining the case of Summer Wells and, in particular, the first public interview given by her grandmother, Candus Harer, a series of clear lessons emerges. These lessons do not just apply to this case, but to the broader field of criminal investigations, public communication, and how the court of public opinion interacts with ongoing law enforcement work. They speak to the complex interplay between truth-telling, perception, and the gaps that investigators must navigate. First, perfect alignment between witness statements is not always a sign of reliability. When two primary witnesses share, Harer and her daughter Candus offer accounts that match each other down to the smallest detail after many months, it can create the appearance of coordination rather than authenticity. In natural conversation, especially when recalling events from months or years earlier, small differences are expected. People remember different angles, highlight different moments, and recall certain sensory details more vividly than others. That's normal human memory, but when timelines, specific props, like planting cacti or eating a peppermint candy, and even narrative pacing remain identical, it may signal the creation of a unified story, rather than the independent recollection of two people. This is not, in itself, proof of wrongdoing, but it is a red flag that investigators will examine closely. Second, gaps in a timeline are investigative gold mines. Every missing minute between verifiable events is a potential container for actions or occurrences that change the case entirely. In Harer's account, there are segments such as activities after the hospital visit, but before Summer was last seen that have no independent witnesses or physical evidence to confirm them. These moments are inherently vulnerable to doubt. An uncorroborated timeline leaves investigators asking, was there an unmentioned detour? Did someone else enter the picture? Were there environmental factors, like unexpected visitors, that could shift the context of what happened? Filling in these voids is often the key to breaking a case open. Third, delivery matters as much as content. In Harer's interview, observers noted a cold tone, limited emotional range, and tightly constrained answers that never expanded beyond the core timeline. Even if every word she said were accurate, the perception of detachment can undermine public trust. True crime history is littered with examples of witnesses, or even innocent suspects being judged more by how they looked or sounded than by the substance of their statements. Law enforcement understands this dynamic, which is why trained interviewers sometimes work to draw people out emotionally to see how they react when the conversation leaves the safe territory of memorized facts. Fourth, there is a critical difference between being ready to answer if asked and being proactive. Harer told interviewers she was willing to speak to law enforcement if they contacted her. That sounds reasonable on its face, but in a missing child case, proactive contact calling to offer updates, following up on investigative progress, or volunteering new thoughts can signal genuine engagement and urgency. The contrast between her willingness to call the police when YouTubers entered her property and her apparent unwillingness to initiate contact about her granddaughter's investigation raises questions about priorities and motivation. Fifth, personal history shapes credibility in the eyes of the public. In Harer's case, there are public records of previous legal issues, allegations of child endangerment in 2 states, and multiple aliases over the years. While these elements may have perfectly ordinary explanations such as marriage, divorce, or unrelated incidents, they inevitably become part of the lens through which the public and media interpret her words. For investigators, this background can influence how much corroboration they seek for her statements, not because it proves deception, but because it establishes patterns of behavior and possible stress points. Sixth, the rarity of multiple unsolved disappearances in one family magnifies suspicion. The disappearance of Harer's other daughter, Rosemary Bly, years earlier remains unsolved. Statistically, It is highly unusual for two members of the same extended family to vanish without explanation. While coincidence is possible, such a history inevitably leads the public, and sometimes investigators, to explore whether there are environmental, relational, or behavioral factors that could link the cases. This does not mean the two events are connected, but it ensures that the family history becomes part of the investigative landscape. Seventh, public interviews can serve as indirect investigative tools. Even when an interview contains no new facts, it may be valuable for law enforcement to see how a person handles the spotlight. Do they maintain composure under pressure? Do they deviate from prior statements when pressed? Are there signs of rehearsed language or unexpected hesitation? Sometimes, investigators use these moments not for the content, but for the behavioral data they reveal. Harer's composure, her unwillingness to expand beyond the set timeline, and her avoidance of speculation all become data points in this behavioral profile. Eighth, social media is both an amplifier and a distorting lens. The online true crime community, particularly YouTubers who focus on the Wells case, dissected Harer's interview relentlessly. This level of attention can help surface inconsistencies or patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed, but it also creates an echo chamber where speculation can harden into assumed fact. For Harer, this meant that every phrase, facial expression, and body movement was reinterpreted dozens of times by audiences with varying biases. In some ways, this environment makes it harder for the truth, whatever it may be, to emerge cleanly, because every narrative has already been pre-framed for or against her. Taken together, these lessons suggest that the intersection of public communication, investigative rigor, and human perception is a delicate and often volatile space. For investigators, the challenge is to extract useful, verifiable facts from statements that may be carefully constructed, incomplete, or colored by self-protection. For the public, the challenge is to distinguish between impressions, whether they come from tone, facial expression, or online rumor, and the hard evidence that can be tested in court. In the end, the Harer interview stands as a case study in how missing person investigations are not only battles for facts, but also for narrative control. The way a story is told can either build confidence in the search for truth or deepen the shadows surrounding it. For those seeking justice for Summer Wells, the hope is that these lessons can guide sharper questioning, more thorough verification, and a more discerning eye toward the complex human factors that play out in every high-profile case. Beyond the specific contours of the Summer Wells case, the interview with Candus Harer illustrates a broader truth about missing person investigations. How a story is told can weigh just as heavily as the story itself. Law enforcement and the public do not only parse facts, they also measure tone, body language, and the consistency of delivery. A witness may believe they are protecting themselves by offering a limited, precise account, but the very act of narrowing the scope can invite suspicion. In this sense, communication becomes a double-edged sword. The choice of words, the absence of emotion, and the unwillingness to deviate from a fixed timeline all become data points in the investigation, regardless of whether they reveal anything substantive. This dynamic is not confined to the Wells family. In cases from John Bennett Ramsey to Madeleine McCann, families have discovered that the public often judges them less on hard evidence than on how their grief or composure appears under scrutiny. A trembling voice or a tear can be interpreted as sincerity. A calm tone or unemotional retelling can be interpreted as detachment, or worse, deception. These expectations create an impossible standard for families already in crisis. They also complicate the work of investigators, who must sift through both evidence and perception, aware that the two often collide. The larger lesson is that perception, once formed, can become as durable as fact. The narrative that surrounds a case, whether shaped by family interviews, media coverage, or online speculation, can influence leads, tip lines, and even the momentum of the investigation itself. If the public believes a witness is hiding something, that belief can overshadow new evidence. If the public believes the story has already been told, apathy may set in before the truth is uncovered. The open question, then, is whether this case will ultimately be resolved through physical evidence, an undeniable discovery that pierces the fog of speculation, or whether it will remain caught in the self, perpetuating cycle of narrative and counter-narrative. Until that answer emerges, the Harer interview is less a solution than a mirror, reflecting the uneasy balance between truth, perception, and the stories we choose to believe.